The AWS S3 typo that broke the internet, a DevOps Postmortem. It's no 9937 PST on February 28, 2017, and the digital world is about to hit a brick wall. At first, it looks like a routine maintenance task, a standard playbook command executed by an engineer trying to trim a few servers from the S3 billing system. But one single typo in that command changes everything. Instead of pruning a handful of nodes, it wipes out a massive chunk of capacity across both the index and placement subsystems in the US East 1 region. Within minutes, the heart of the cloud starts to skip beats. Because these core systems hadn't been fully restarted in years, the recovery isn't instant. It's a slow, agonizing crawl through hours of cascading failures. By mid-morning, S3 is buckling under the weight of its own dependencies, and for thousands of downstream services, the internet just feels broken. One typo. That's all it took to bring a Titan to its knees. Picture this. It's February 28, 2017, and you're looking at the backbone of the modern internet, Amazon S3. For most people, S3 is the place where files live, but for us in the trenches, it's the foundational layer that almost every other cloud service leans on to function. When S3 goes down, things don't just glitch. The entire ecosystem starts to crumble like a house of cards. At 937 PST, a single engineer attempting a routine maintenance task on the billing system triggered a catastrophic chain reaction in the US East 1 region. Instead of pruning a handful of servers as intended, a typo in a command wiped out a massive chunk of capacity across both the index and placement subsystems. Because these core components hadn't been fully restarted in years, the recovery wasn't just a quick reboot. It became a grueling, multi-hour marathon to get the internet back online. It was February 28, 2017, and for most of the world, it was just another Tuesday dealing with the backbone of the internet, Amazon S3. In the US East 1 region, everything was humming along exactly as it should. The infrastructure was massive, stable, and crucially it hadn't needed a full subsystem restart in years. That's the kind of set-it-and-forget-it confidence that feels like safety until it becomes a trap. At 9:37 PST, an engineer sat down to perform a routine maintenance task on the S3 billing system. They weren't trying to nuke the kingdom, they were just running an established playbook command intended to prune a small handful of servers. It was a standard procedure, a minor housekeeping task in a gargantuan system, but hidden inside that command was a single, devastating typo, a tiny slip of the fingers that would turn a routine cleanup into a catastrophic collapse of capacity. It started at 9:37 PST on February 28, 2017. It wasn't a sophisticated cyber attack or a massive hardware failure. It was something much more human, a typo. An engineer, following an established playbook to prune just a handful of servers from the S3 billing system, entered a command with a mistyped parameter. In an instant, that tiny slip deleted a massive chunk of capacity across two core subsystems in the US E1 region, index and placement. Almost immediately, the alarms started screaming. What began as a routine maintenance task morphed into a full-blown crisis as S3, the backbone of the cloud, began to buckle. Because these specific subsystems hadn't been fully restarted in years, the recovery didn't just stall, it stalled hard. By mid-morning, the ripple effect was hitting everything downstream, and the scale of the outage was becoming painfully clear to everyone watching the monitors. It started with a single command and a single typo at 9:37 PST on February 28, 2017. An engineer, just trying to trim a few servers from the S3 billing system, accidentally nuked way more capacity than they intended in the US East 1 region. Because of that one mistyped parameter, both the index and placement subsystems were gutted. This was the spark, but the explosion was much larger. Since these core subsystems hadn't been fully restarted in years, the recovery didn't just stall, it cratered. The failure cascaded instantly, radiating outward from S3 to every downstream service that relied on it for data storage. For hours, the S3 is down ripple effect paralyzed the region. It wasn't just a local glitch anymore. It was a systemic collapse of the infrastructure's backbone, turning a simple maintenance task into a multi-hour nightmare of widespread errors across the entire ecosystem. It wasn't some sophisticated cyber attack or a sophisticated architectural flaw. It was a single, devastating typo in a standard maintenance command. At 9:37 PST on February 28, An engineer attempting to prune just a few servers from the S3 billing system executed a playbook that overcorrected. Because of a mistyped parameter, the command didn't just trim some fat, it gutted the capacity of both the index and placement subsystems in the US East-1 region. This was the perfect storm scenario. Those specific subsystems hadn't been fully restarted in years. When they went down, the system couldn't gracefully reroute traffic, causing a massive cascade of errors across every downstream service relying on S3. Because the recovery path for these aging components was practically unknown, it took hours to manually cycle them back to life, while the internet essentially buckled under the weight of the outage. Imagine the sheer scale of what happens when a single typo ripples through a foundational layer of the internet. At 9:37 PST on February 28, 2017, a maintenance command intended to prune a handful of servers instead gutted the S3 index and placement subsystems in the US East-1 region. This wasn't just a local glitch, it was a systemic collapse. Because these critical subsystems hadn't been fully restarted in years, the recovery didn't just stall, it stalled hard. For over 4 hours, the blast radius expanded outward, crippling not only S3 but every downstream service that relied on it to function. By mid-morning, the S3 name became synonymous with a massive outage for thousands of customers. It wasn't just an internal hiccup, it was a multi-hour blackout of core infrastructure, proving exactly how much damage one mistyped parameter can do when your dependencies are concentrated in a single region. The clock hit 9:37 PST when a single typo turned a routine maintenance task into a full-blown catastrophe. An engineer running an established playbook intended to prune just a handful of servers, but instead, the command wiped out a massive chunk of capacity across both the S3 index and placement subsystems in the US East-1 region. By mid-morning, the damage was systemic. Because these core systems hadn't been fully restarted in years, the recovery didn't just stall, it stalled hard. The team was suddenly fighting a ghost in the machine as errors cascaded through every service tethered to S3. For hours, they were operating in a high-pressure vacuum, manually wrestling with infrastructure that wasn't designed to be rebooted so frequently. It took nearly 4 hours of grueling work to finally get those subsystems back online and restore normalcy to the region. The fix wasn't a magic wand. It was a grueling, manual slog through the wreckage of the US East-1 region. Engineers had to manually restart the S3 index and placement subsystems components that hadn't seen a full reboot in years, which is why the recovery crawled so slowly. While they were wrestling with those systems, the team scrambled to restore service, eventually bringing things back to normal about 4 hours after the initial disaster at 9:37 PST. But they didn't just patch and pray, they overhauled the underlying tooling. They implemented hard guardrails into the maintenance commands to ensure that no single typo could ever drop capacity below a safe threshold again. They also started regularly exercising those recovery paths, making sure that if something does break, the system knows how to stand back up without taking half the internet down with it. Look, we've all had those moments where a single keystroke feels like a grenade pin being pulled. This wasn't just a oops moment. It was a masterclass in why your tooling needs to have some teeth. When that engineer executed the command at 9:37 PST, they weren't trying to nuke the region, they were just following a playbook. But because the system didn't have hard guardrails to block removing capacity below safe thresholds, a typo turned a minor maintenance task into a catastrophe for 2 core S3 subsystems. The real kicker? Because those specific systems hadn't been fully restarted in years, the recovery crawled on for hours. The takeaway here is twofold. Your tools must be smart enough to say no when a command looks suicidal, and you have to dogfood your recovery paths. If you don't regularly exercise your restart procedures, you won't know they're broken until the blast radius hits everyone else. That's how Amazon Web Services turned a very bad day into a lesson. If this saved you an outage, subscribe for the next postmortem.